Okay, so I was down at the Gully, actually going to begin right now. I was down at the Gully and getting ready for this, and the Gully enters right into the waters of the Niagara River, and I saw this guy swimming by, and I thought it was a pretty good indication. He's probably a cousin of Charlie the Tuna. I take it there's somebody coming in that door. You guys give a dead giveaway, okay. But I put it up here just for fun because the COVID thing has not gone away. I'm sick of it, you're sick of it, but it's not sick of us. So we will try and practice social distancing as much as we can. I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about the area that we're talking about. This is a Google Earth map of the village of Lewiston, Queenston, the Niagara River. This is the parkway coming down Lewiston Hill. This is Art Park right here, okay? I'll give you a blow up of that. This is Tuscarora Street in the village. This is the lower parking lot in Art Park. This is the main theater, the amphitheater. This is where 4th Street enters and turns to, if you imagine driving down 4th Street in there, it turns left and then comes up around the red brick road. And then right in here, there exists a gully that is difficult to see if you're not thinking about it. You wouldn't be able to see it at all if it wasn't for Joan Jipp, and I'm going to give her props right now because Joan, many of you know Joan, she's a longtime activist in the town of Lewiston. When the Power Authority owned this, they decided that that gully was a pain, and they went to fill it in. So they started to put pipe in and level it out. Joan literally went and laid down in front of the bulldozers and absolutely refused to let them do that, so that we have a remnant of this gully today. It's not as big as it used to be when I first knew it, but if it wasn't for Joan Jipp, we'd be talking about a different sort of geographic phenomena right now. When I talk about history, and I'm a land surveyor by trade, and when I do land surveys, I work in 4 dimensions. I work in latitude, longitude, elevation, and time. Because even the house that you've got has been different over the years, different fences, different structures, and so on and so forth. I like to think about that in terms of the importance of the history here, because a lot of places in the world are important because something happened or someone lived at a point at one time. In this particular case, on this property, there is layer upon layer upon layer of important historical happenings and events that, when taken cumulatively, make it one of the most amazing historical places in the United States. And very few people know that or appreciate that. And so this whole ground tour that I started 2 years ago was my endeavor to make sure that more people in the community appreciated that. And we got thinking about the fact that a lot of people either cannot do a hike around our park because we do a little climbing, or haven't had the opportunity. So let's put it in a sit-down form, and that's what I'm attempting to do today. It's not going to come in any sort of a strict chronological fashion, but I hope that I can tell the story for you. I talk a little bit about the impact of time on a site. So you see this picture. This is Art Park in 2020. I want to point one thing out to you. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Wrong button. 4th Street entrance comes down, and you're driving down, and you turn left right there, right? Now take a look at this picture. That's the same picture in 1934. Comes from Google Earth history. And you'll see 4th Street entrance comes down now, and instead of turning left, it turns right, comes down along the shore, and goes to, well, what is this? That's the old Lewiston-Queenston Bridge. That's the way you went to Canada before the new bridge was built, 1960, 1961. And at the time, of course, Art Park didn't exist. These bright zones right here are stone quarries. Stone has been quarried out of that site since the French were here prior to 1759. The 2 large redoubts in Fort Niagara, the tallest of the redoubts that look like twins, the stone for them were quarried from this site. Some of the stone, at least for the Frontier House, was quarried from this site. So it's a lot of history with respect to the stone quarries. This little site right here being disturbed, most likely, in my opinion, is the beginning of the construction of the Chateau Gay winery. The Chateau Gay belonged there for a very, very long period of time before the Power Authority came and bought this land and the shadow gate moved out on the Ridge Road. There are 1934. Now the other thing I want to point out is there are 3 railroads coming through this site. A lot of people don't understand that. There's this railroad that goes down right along the escarpment on a slight slope. That's called the Hojack Line. The reason it's called the Hojack Line is originally the cars were pulled by horses, at least one of which was named Jack. Does that communicate? Whoa, Jack. So that one goes all the way up, becomes the Rome, Ogdensburg, and Watertown. That railroad went all the way up to Watertown at one point in time. The second one is this one. This is the New York Central Railroad. Comes right down by the stone quarries, comes down, it actually feeds back, and it continued on down 5th Street to the village of Youngstown. I don't know if you can see it or not, I'm going to try and point it out, but right here, this road, there's a little siding, goes off like this, and comes down Tuscarora Street, and you can tell how nervous I am, can't you? And then there's a little circle right here through Art Park, and went down to the foot of Center Street. And there it would pick up passengers from the steamships that came from Toronto and from Rochester and other places. And then the third is this bright line right here. This is the Niagara Gorge route. The Niagara Gorge route went from Niagara Falls to Lewiston. It ran from 1895 to 1935, so it was actually running when this photograph was taken. And I'll show you there's another picture. This is that New York Central Railroad. This is the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge. We're looking north. This is the upper hiking trail at Art Park, if you've ever been in it. And there used to be a large tunnel right there that we played in when we were kids. There was a little cave over top of it. But that tunnel, right now, as you start to enter this pathway, there's a mound on the river side of it. That's all that's left of it, because it's all going away. When the Power Authority built this, they widened that out and they brought utes down, bringing rock from the power plant site to Lewiston. Here's a little map that shows, this is the New York Central Railroad. There's the siding going off this way. It stops, comes down Tuscarora Street and around, and it shows the Niagara Gorge Railroad. This is the area where the Gully is. That was known as, that time, Ferry Street, and I'll tell you why it was called Ferry Street in a little while. But you can see that the railroads in Lewiston were very intricate. There was returning loops. There was loops, went up Center Street for a while, then down 5th and down Onondaga. The railroads were quite important in Lewiston at one point in time. And they all came through Art Park. This sign was just installed this summer. Tom Collisher, our curator, was there for the dedication ceremony. I was away. And it talks about the Niagara Gorge Railroad, and it mentions President William McKinley rode the trolley September 6, 1901. So does everybody know that President McKinley came to Lewiston that morning, and what happened later in the day? He got shot. Do you know that he wasn't intended to be shot in Buffalo? I can never remember the guy's name. Somebody can correct me. It's more difficult to pronounce, but the guy who shot him had a gun in his hand and a bandage around the gun to camouflage him. And that's how he got to the president at the Pan American Exposition, shot him in the belly. He died several days later. Teddy Roosevelt became president. However, after that happened, the gentleman who worked at the hotel, and I think it was either Angler's Retreat or it was Pitt's Angler's Retreat or the American Hotel, I don't remember which, told the story to the authorities that a man had come in the day before with a bandage on his right hand, and he rented a room. And instead of asking for a room facing the river, like most people would do, he specifically asked for one facing the railroad tracks in the back of the building. Now what happened was, there were such crowds that were interested in seeing the president that the train could not get to the point where it was appointed to get to, where he was going to address the crowds. It had to stop before it got there. And after some finagling, they just turned that train around and went back, and the guy had to leave there and go back to Buffalo, and that's where he shot him. So Lewiston dodged the bullet literally that day, and we can be thankful for that. So what we're talking about in the lower landing is the birth of Niagara Falls, the earliest visitors to come here, which was not hundreds of years ago, but thousands of years ago. We're going to talk about the burial mound, the portage. The European entrada is a fancy way of saying the Europeans coming in to the territory. American at last, development and prosperity and ups and downs. I'm going to take a minute, though, to introduce someone to you that is very, very important to Lewiston history. There's a series of photographs here that are from a publication in the Buffalo Courier Express, Sunday edition, color insert, August 2nd, 1959. It's entitled Digging for History in Lewiston. And this is one of the first times that people began to appreciate the history. And the reason is, for the most part, this gentleman right here, who is Richard McCarthy. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, there were not a lot of trained archaeologists. There were certainly none in Western New York. Richard had an interest in history, and he studied archaeology from the viewpoint of the detail that it requires to do a proper archaeological excavation. So for the first time, instead of coming into this area with a pick and a shovel and digging furiously trying to find things, they'd come to an area, they'd study the background writings about it, they would lay out grids perpendicular to each other, they would locate things very carefully, excavations done by the Niagara Association, which is a group of amateurs worked with Richard. Literally, once they took the top layer off, at this site, the top layer was the waste product from the building in the Niagara Gorge. Then there was black topsoil, which was the most recent artifacts, normally American. Another strata went down, you found a lot of British artifacts. Go down deeper, you'd find French artifacts, and go below that, you would find artifacts going back thousands of years. They excavated these things painstakingly. They have trowels, and they would scrape dirt away, and they'd brush it. And when they found what they had, they'd measure it in the grid, they'd get the depth down. They'd make sketches, they'd record it. And for the first time, he brought scientific archaeology to Lewiston. I like to say that between Richard McCarthy and Margaret Robeson, who wrote this little gem, Under the Mountain, 1959, I was 12 years old. This came out in 1958. This photograph was 1959. And I was an only child, and between those two things, I really got interested in the fact that I lived right at the Gully. That was where my house was. So I was fascinated by all of that. So some of the photographs here, this is a picture of the Gully from the Niagara River. This building is still there. That's a concrete stair built. That's the pump house. The village of Lewiston used to get the drinking water out of that gully many years ago. This little cottage, 3 years before this, had been someone's cottage on the river. And then in 1956, before the Power Authority had put in the ice boom, we had an ice jam. And went all the way up the gully and knocked it off its pegs, and they abandoned it. They came in the next spring, took what they want, and left behind a nice little playhouse that we used to call the Crooked House. And you'd stand in it kind of like this all the time. It was a lot of fun. This is a closer view of Mr. McCarthy. This is Clarence Lewis, who's the Niagara County historian. This guy, I believe, is Peter Mangold. I'm not sure how he fits in, but they were all studying the site. And here's a picture of Ed and Betty Koshin. The Koshins were from Niagara Falls. They were part of the Niagara organization, and they're running a sifter. Now, after you get done with the delicate excavation with a trowel and brush, you end up with a pile of waste product. They take that waste product and put it in this shaker, which they shake it back and forth, the dirt would fall out, and you'd find all sorts of other artifacts. This fellow right here is Jeff Sattel, and this fellow right here is me. So this is the nexus as to why my passion exists for the history of here. When you're 12 years old and you're allowed by an adult to put your hands in there and pick up a piece of pottery that last was held by somebody 300 or 400 years ago, it kind of burns something into your psyche. I want to make a point right now because we have a special guest here this evening who we just recently met. Jean, would you put your hand up, please? You don't have to stand up. Jean Gundy is Richard McCarthy's daughter. And Tom and I, and a member of the Historical Association, were pleased to meet her in September at a celebration art park for the 300th anniversary of the building of LaSalle's Magasin Royale. So we invited her tonight because I wanted to make a point that this history, for the work of her father, is much better known than it would have been without him. Okay, so let's talk about Niagara Falls. Just 12,000 years ago, same latitude, same longitude, different elevation. You can do this, Ken. All of New York State, you see the outline of New York State? It's underneath the Laurentide ice sheet. 12,000 years ago was the last age of the glaciers. So if you're standing at the Gully 12,000 years ago, you're standing under 5,000 feet of ice. It was cold. It was frigid. And what happened? So the ice began to melt back to the north, so the glacier itself became the north edge of Lake Iroquois. So this is a sketch that shows what the land looked like partway through the melting process. And so this line here is the current shoreline of Lake Ontario. At the point they did this was the Lake Iroquois shoreline, which is this white line, essentially Route 104 Ridge Road. At the point they did this, it was Ridge Road. This yellow line is the brow of the Niagara Escarpment. This, of course, is the Niagara River. This is where Niagara Falls is now. Here's Grand Island. And then above the escarpment was the remains of Lake Tonawanda. And it was melting and it was draining. And there were 5 spots where it was flowing over the escarpment. You see 2 of them here. But each got, the water surface got lower and lower and lower, the last one to rise was this one. So ultimately, Lake Tonawanda drained into, and then, of course, all of the water from Lake Erie and the upper Great Lakes were also draining in here. And this was the point where the falls first developed, being only about 30 meters high, about 90 feet. That would have been about 10,000 years ago. And so in the 12,000 years, it has eroded back to where it is right now. So, quite literally, the birthplace of Niagara Falls, the lower landing right here in the village of Lewiston. So we're going to talk about the lower landing, and I talked about it in terms of countless nations struggling to the death over the control of this. Now we know that the United States is there. We know that Great Britain was here. We know before that was the French. But before that were many, many native nations that also fought over control of the lower landing. Why did they do that? Well, that's the way you got around all of America. There were no roads. So if you're going to walk 300 miles from Albany to Buffalo, you're going to carry on your back whatever you need, and you're going to go along this path, and it's going to take you a little while to do that. The alternative was to get in a boat in the Mohawk River, and with a couple of portages, get into Lake Ontario, and come all the way to Lewiston, and then another portage around Niagara Falls, and then Lake Erie, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Huron. So water travel was the way to communicate with that body of people that were dwelling inside America. And so people fought for that for many, many years. I like to think this photograph is very reminiscent of the way the portage, the Gully would have looked like in 1720 when Jonquière arrived to build his Magasin Royal. Now I'm going to spend a little time with this picture. In red you see Canada, in green you see the United States. I can make a lot of points here about it. First of all, this is New York State right here. Okay, you can see the shape of it. In New York State, at the time that the French began to come in, and that's the part I'm entering into now, this was controlled by the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Haudenosaunee. In the early 1700s, 1710, 1720, the Tuscaroras came home. And by that I mean the Tuscaroras have been living in coastal North Carolina, had a wonderful area down there, but the people who were landing on the shore literally drove them out. And I say they came home because when they got to New York, they knew that there was enough similarity in the Tuscarora tongue to the Seneca and the Cayuga and the Onondaga that they certainly at some point in antiquity had also been family. So the 5 nations adopted them in and it became the 6 nations. They spread out across New York State. The Mohawk were the most easterly, and the Seneca, keepers of the western door, were the most westerly, and they controlled the portage. Up here, there were a whole lot of other Indians, Algonquins and Hurons. The Algonquins and the Hurons didn't get along with the Haudenosaunee. The people to the south didn't get along with the Haudenosaunee. The Iroquois Confederacy was known as being a very fierce conquering type of people, and they went hundreds of miles to do the conquering. That'll come back into the picture in a minute. So, early 1500s, Europe is running out of food. By that I mean they had so depleted their fisheries that they couldn't get decent captures of fish to feed the population. So some brave fishermen came all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to the shores of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, that area, where they found prodigious amounts of cod. And when they got the word back there, entire fishing fleets would come here, they would get cod, and to get the cod to take them back, they'd have to take them on the land, clean them, and smoke them in a fire to preserve them, and then take them back to Europe. While they're on land, they came into contact with the local natives. And the natives were wearing a lot of fur. Fur was very, very popular in Europe. So when the fishermen took word back that there was a lot of fur, there were all sorts of fur-bearing animals in this area. Fur was so popular in Europe that all the fur-bearing animals had just about been depleted, and the price of fur was sky high. So they saw this opportunity, the French saw an opportunity to trade with the natives, bring them whatever they could bring from Europe, get the natives who were very skilled at getting furs, to bring them furs and create a fur trade. That was the precedent for Jacques Cartier coming, and he sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence in 1534. And he explored this area, and they said, yeah, this is where we want to be. 1608, Samuel de Champlain came and founded Quebec City and Mount Royal, which we know as Montreal. And we then have, in the early 1600s, French settlements up here. Little side story. This is not really a tangent, don't yell at me. In 1608, Champlain went back to Europe to restock, and he came back with a young boy, 8 years of age. His name was Etienne Brulé. Etienne was an orphan. He didn't have any education whatsoever, couldn't read or write, but Champlain took him under his wing, brought him back, and they lived in Quebec City. 2 years later, when Etienne is 10, Champlain sends him to live with the Algonquin in Upper Canada. Why? Well, I told you the French wanted to have a close relationship with the natives to get this trade going. The problem is, all of the natives, whether they're Algonquin or Iroquois, they didn't need anything the French were offering them. They had lived here for millennia on their own. They were very competent people. And so the French were getting frustrated they couldn't get this trade going to make their wealth come back to Europe. So Champlain's idea was, Etienne, you go live with them, you learn their culture, you learn to speak their language, and you become my interpreter. And this was used several times by the French. They would embed people into the native population. In 1615, now the only thing we know about Brulé is what Champlain himself wrote and what certain missionaries would write from time to time, because he couldn't leave a record. But we know in 1615 he came with 10 Algonquin, and they were going down to Pennsylvania to try to get an arrangement to fight against the Haudenosaunee. And they came down the Humber River, which comes into Lake Ontario in Toronto. They came across Lake Ontario, and they came to the mouth of the Niagara River. Now, full disclosure, what I think, and what Bob Emerson, who's the executive director of Old Fort Niagara, thinks, are two different stories from this point forward. Bob believes, based upon writings of other people, that they went by the mouth of the Niagara River, went to Irondequoit Bay, and down to Genesee. Well, the problem with that, to my way of thinking, is the largest village for the Seneca was a place called Ganondagan. It's in Victor, New York today. That's where we visited a couple of years ago. It was a large Seneca village. It doesn't make sense to me that they would want to go right by the neighborhood. The other thing is that Niagara Falls had a very spiritual sort of draw to the natives. It was amazing even back then. If he was sitting in a canoe at the mouth of the Niagara River in 1615, you could both see and hear Niagara Falls easily. Because at that time, the flow of that falls was at least twice what you see today. Today, we got 2 power plants on either side pulling it out and bypassing water. Pouchot, who was the captain of the French occupation Fort Niagara, writes in there that he could hear it and see it easily. So I think that Brulé, who was adventurous, knew about Niagara Falls, could hear and see it, and it was a safer route. I think he came down the Niagara River, came up that gully, and in 1615 may very well have been one of the very first French people or European people to enter the village, what would be the village of Lewiston. But again, like so many things in history, there is a counter argument to that. So I'm telling you straight up, I don't know that that's the way it is, but that's what I like to believe. So the French are here. I got an itchy finger. The French are here along the St. Lawrence River, and in 1678, by 1678, another Frenchman by the name of LaSalle had come and joined the effort. And LaSalle was living with these people in Quebec and Montreal. And in 1678, he left with a boat from Fort Frontenac, which is near Kingston, Ontario, came across the Lake Ontario and to the mouth of the Niagara River. He wrote about doing that, but he never entered it at the time. I think he had a coffee clutch back at the house, whatever the case is. He didn't come into the river. He came back in 1678 with a plan. He was a very adventurous entrepreneur. His plan was to be the first person to sail Lake Erie and the Upper Lakes from this perspective. So he came back in 1678 with another ship, with a shipbuilder, with carpenters, and with materials to build another ship. And in December 1678, they landed in the Gully in what we know as our park today. And they walked around Niagara Falls. They went up to Cayuga Island. They formed another place up there, which was their camp, and they began to build what was going to be the Griffin, the first ship ever to set sail on Lake Erie from the Europeans. When he came here, he reckons that he got up on what is known as Le Plateau. That's the flat spot at Art Park. It's at the top of the gully before it goes up the rest of the escarpment. The French call that Le Plateau. He says he found 10 cabins of Senecas. This is a picture of a classic longhouse. That is the cabin that the Senecas would have lived in. So this very well could have been exactly what LaSalle saw. Got hills in the background. It could look just like what he saw in 1678. Inside, this is the way the structure is. There's several different campfires. These were occupied by families based upon a matriarchal system. The matriarchs were the bosses. And so a young boy, when he grew up, he'd have to leave this family, and he would go, if he married, he would then become part of the family of the woman that he married. But anyway, you see they got sleeping arrangements, they got storage, and it's really pretty cool to see, so Esther and I went back to see it. This is an actual replicated longhouse at Ganondagon in Victor, New York. And Esther and I went, we were setting up the bus trip, we went and had a good time there. So, I don't know. This is another thing he would have seen. Can you see, there's a hill right here. It's a mound. That is an Indian burial mound. It was there when LaSalle came in 1678. It was almost there when Jesus Christ was walking the earth. It's a Hopewellian burial mound. And it has been excavated. It was excavated the first time by the British soldiers in a helter-skelter fashion. They just went in with picks and shovels and tore it apart looking for good stuff, and they left it demolished.
Were all the Haudenosaunee, were they all mound builders?
All the Haudenosaunee?
Yeah,
No, none of them were. None of them were. That's what's interesting about this.
Okay.
That burial mound is an anomaly.
Okay.
The Hopewell came from Ohio. That's where you find burial mound after burial mound after burial mound.
Right.
But this area is the limit of their influence. So we like to think that the Native Americans didn't get very far out of camp, but they did. They got out quite a bit. So right up here, there's a burial mound, and it's here. And the next thing I want to show you is an example of the science that Richard McCarthy and his people put upon archaeology. In 1962, they excavated that burial mound scientifically, and they found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 burial mounds and a bunch of gorgets. He's got the dimension in there, he's got the orientation. This is the difference between what the British soldiers did and what a science guy does, because when Stuart and Pat Scott, who were both professional archaeologists, worked at Fort Niagara for years, built on Richard's records to put together the story. In fact, one of the reasons we know so much about this is they put together this book called The Archaeological Survey of our Park on the Lower River. And this book is dedicated to Richard. And it's got a lot of great stuff in it. It's out of print right now. We have copies at the museum, but they're not for sale. I think they're kind of archived. I'm not even sure where they're at. But anyway, this is part of the advantage that we've got because Richard McCarthy was there. So I put this in because this shows a Native American putting a pack on his shoulders. When the French came here, they had the 3 mountains. They landed at the water, lower river, and they have to go up 3 mountains to get to the escarpment at the top where Niagara Falls Country Club is right now. That was hard work. And they used to pay the Seneca to carry their packs. And this is just an example of some of the trade bales and what might have happened there. Here is a sketch that shows the portage along the road to the carrying place in the upper river. Another example of it. I don't like to read. You'll notice a lot of my slides don't have reading in it, but this is a description. There's another one on the next page. I want to talk about this one. Peter Kalm in 1750. Here on the carrying place, I saw about 200 Indians, most of them belonging to the Six Nations, bring in carrying packs of furs, chiefly deer and bear. You would be surprised to see what abundance of these things are brought every day over this place. An Indian gets 20 pence for every pack he carries over, the distance being about 3 leagues. 3 leagues is about 7 miles. So they're paying these people 20 cents to put 100 pounds on their back, literally crawl on all fours up the hill, and then walk to the upper landing and drop things off. The other interesting is by Charlevoix in 1721. It's called The Carrying Place of Niagara is ever very ill-wooded, and you cannot walk 10 paces without treading on anthills or meeting with rattlesnakes, especially during the heat of the day. You can be thankful you weren't here then because there were abundance of rattlesnakes in the area. Okay, so this brings us now to the epitome of the French occupation, and that happened 300 years ago this year. Louis Thomas Chaubert de Jonquière is an interesting character. One of the stories I didn't tell about the French and the British, or the French and the natives, is I got to give you a little bit of background on this. The natives kept rebuffing trade with the French, and the French kept trying to find ways to make it work. So in 1688, the French commander of Upper Canada was a fellow by the name of Denonville. He brought an army across Lake Ontario with French soldiers and Algonquin Indians. He went down along the Genesee River, and just before winter, he destroyed all of the foodstuffs of the Seneca Nation in their biggest villages. And then he boastfully said, I'm going back to the mouth of the Niagara River. I'm going to build a little trading post. I've got food. I'll feed you all winter. Just bring me furs. So they couldn't convince them to do it. He's going to force them to do it. So they did. He went back to the mouth of the Niagara River. He built a little fortress that he called Fort Denonville. I can't imagine building a Fort Sloggenhop, but anyway, he did. He left 100 people there. Yeah? Denonville. Denonville literally means of no city.
So not the Duke d'Anville.
Not the which what? What?
Okay, there was a French explorer who supposedly came into the Maritimes named d'Anville.
I don't know
I just
Dundee.
wanted to make sure.
No,
Okay.
this is well, V-I-L-L-E in French is often pronounced V.
Right,
It's
that's
quick.
what I'm saying, d'Anville, yeah.
Well, I don't know, it could be. He was actually the governor of Upper Canada in 1688.
Okay, thank you.
So anyway, he did this, and he left 100 people with this little fort at what is now Fort Niagara, and he went back to spend the winter in his nice warm cabin. And the Senecas came, just like he planned. They came, but they didn't come with their hat in their hand. They came and they surrounded that little fort. They'd send 4 or 5 guys out to cut firewood. They'd never see him again. Send 2 or 3 people out to get water. They'd never see him again. By April the next year, there were about a dozen of the 100 left, and they were emaciated and dying. And so Denonville came back, found them, burnt the fort, and that didn't work. Now, the reason I tell this story is I want to tell the story of Jean Caire. Jean Caire, a Frenchman, either on the Denonville raid or at another occasion, was captured by the Seneca. And he was taken back to a village, and he was about to be burned at the stake. In order to do that, he had to run a gauntlet. This was a process that was designed to turn the captive into a bubbling bowl of fear. So you put him through this long gauntlet, that everybody hits him, and then they burn him at the stake. Jean Caire had no part of it. He was small, wiry. Before they could beat the drum to tell him to start, he took off. He started knocking people down, punching people, kicking people, spitting at people. He actually knocked one of the chiefs to the ground and knocked him out. So the Seneca said, well, that's pretty brave. We're going to give you a choice. You can be adopted by our tribe, or we'll burn you at the stake. I don't think that choice took very long. So he was adopted into the Senecas, lived with them just like Brulé had lived with the Algonquins. He learned the language, he learned the culture. He took a wife from the Senecas. This was in the late 1600s. So by 1720, the French had used him to build relationship, and Jean Caire, because of his influence with the Senecas, finally got permission from some part of the Seneca tribe to build Le Magazine Royal.
5 original nations inhabited New York State. The Iroquois people, or the Haudenosaunee. Here, specifically, the Onondaga, the Seneca people. It's our understanding that the Thunder Beings in our stories, they originate at the falls. So even smaller nations from around the Great Lakes area came to this place in particular, not only because it was good fishing and good hunting ground, but also because of the mighty Niagara. So you had this powerful place that just naturally draws people here, still does to this day.
We're commemorating the 300th anniversary of the establishment of Le Magazine Royal. This was a trading post that was created by Lieutenant Louis Thomas Chabert de Jonquière. He was an officer of the Compagnie Franche de la Marine. He was a trader and a diplomat. He had very close relations with the Seneca who lived in this neighborhood.
This is really the jump off of the main relationship between the French and the surrounding natives here. They had a good relationship as far as trade and commerce and working together at an early stage.
Of course, you can't navigate Niagara Falls either way in a boat. So this was the lower landing on the lower river, and you got out of the water here and you portaged or carried your boats and your cargo up the Niagara escarpment and put everything back in the water above Niagara Falls. So this was a really strategic spot, and Native people had used this portage for millennia before the arrival of any Europeans.
Going from the lower land into the upper river, it gets you into the rest of the interior of the country. So understanding that this place was important because of that, because it connects the rest of the Great Lakes to let you get to the east so you can get to the ocean and vice versa.
The French realized that this was a very strategically important spot, and they were very much afraid that the English would establish a post here first, and that would cut off other French settlements like Detroit. By this time, Louisiana was established. So this area was critical to the French to maintain communications among their colonies here in North America.
For everything to come through here at one point in time makes this area specifically and this Magasin Royal, this grand store, the very first pretty much permanent trading post, so to speak, that's going on.
So the French gain a foothold here on the Niagara at the lower landing. But this is a bark building. It's about 30 by 40 feet in size. And they decide almost right after the construction of this building that a stronger, more fortified post would be necessary. And they begin negotiating for that. From 1720 until 1726, when Fort Niagara was established, this was really the focal point of native French interaction on the Niagara. We're going to recreate the arrival of Jonquière and his party, about 10 men. Our intrepid crew is going to start early in the morning, and they're going to paddle up the Niagara River, the 7 miles from Fort Niagara to the lower landing. That's no mean feat. Very, very strong current. They're going to come up the Gully, the original Gully, on the very land that this happened 300 years ago.
But also what's significant is that we kind of tried to pack as much articles that we could that we know that they actually brought. So we're actually able to put some of these goods, bring them up, and with our native interpreters, there's kind of like a get-together.
And then we'll have a number of interpretive stations scattered around the park where people can learn more about the early 18th century.
To have this kind of event, to have people more familiar with this part of history, it's wonderful.
If I can physically get involved, if I can touch some of those things from that time, if I could, have some of those smells from like cooking demonstrations, the music, the black powder, even the way it's burning, I mean, all of that kind of hits all of your senses. And I think it grasps a hold of you a lot better than just reading it in a book.
And suddenly when I arrive, I see people all dressed up in the time, in their outfit, and I say, wow, this is amazing, because I will say, you see the real history working in front of you. To see this, and you see the people are really passionate. And I think in history, people are all passionate.
We're trying to get the best representation of what historically was correct and what we should be teaching, which is all aspects and all vantage points of our history here in the North American continent, which involves the French, the Native Americans, the British.
We really wanted to raise public awareness of the strategic importance of this spot and of the whole Niagara corridor.
I believe history, it's very active, even if, we get Native American, we get French soldier representative, everything like that. It's very active. And I think for maintaining the history, also the unity of the country, I think it's a common share cultural thing. And I would say for American, it's part of the American history.
This seemed like a great opportunity to really highlight the early history of the region, which is not just about Fort Niagara, and it's not just about the lower landing. It's about all of the Niagara River and what was happening when this was one of the most strategically important places in all of North America.
This place being of that importance, I think, for all of those associations to come together, it's our duty, it's our responsibility to kind of get that word out there that, there's more than just what's going on today. The history is really what makes today makes us able to do what we do today.
Well, planning for this has been going on for over a year, and it's involved about 6 different organizations. Art Park, of course, was the host, Old Fort Niagara. The Historical Association of Lewiston put together a terrific exhibit. The Niagara Falls National Heritage Area supported us financially, and Village of Lewiston, the Tuscarora Nation, all of these organizations really came together to make this a success.
Passing it on to the coming generations is really what it's about. Our responsibility as Ongwehome is to be caretakers of the land. So for us to share the knowledge that we have to pass it on to those coming generations is really important to make their lifestyle a lot easier to help them understand what else needs to be done.
Explaining what happened 300 years ago this year. That happened in September. It was a great day. We enjoyed it a great deal. And it helps you. It's really amazing to see the reenactors walking. It gives you another sense for connection to the history of it. So this is a newspaper article from the Niagara Falls Gazette. I'm not sure what day it is. First area trading post discovered. It was interesting. In this paragraph they say, it is the site of the first permanent type structure in the whole Niagara Buffalo frontier area, a trading post built by John Kerr in 1720. To me that sounds like a Saturday Night Live sketch, John Kerr. But this is with people that just coming to grips with all this, that didn't really know all the detail. This is a blow up the picture. That is Richard McCarthy, Clarence Lewis. This gentleman's name is Glover. I believe he was executive vice president of the Buffalo Erie County Historical Association. And here you see a little hole with a 6-foot rule sticking in. So how this was found, we know exactly where it was. How it was found is, I was thinking Bill Roman would be here tonight, but he's not. Bill's father, John, owned the Bunjo Motel, which is right down on Ferry Street, Bridge Street, now known as South 4th Street. And he decided he wanted to do a little bit of expansion, so he went up on the hill behind his motel, and he had a bulldozer up there, and they're starting to move things around. And in the rows of the thing, they found a rusty sword, they found an axe head, they found pottery shards, and all of a sudden they decided to get a hold of Clarence Lewis. Clarence Lewis got a hold of Richard McCarthy. They came down and they did a site investigation. They brought the people, they got a bunch of people together, and they did the sifting through all the piles that are already there, got a lot of things. And then they began the process of thinking about whether or not this could in fact be Jean Kerr's trading post. So what they began to do is, didn't use machinery, they used a hoe. And everybody was hoeing the topsoil off till it got down to the clay layer. There's a lot of clay here. And they got to that clay layer, that would have been certainly substrata back in 1720, would have been below the ground. And they were doing that, and all of a sudden they come around this circle, this black circle. And it was a very interesting find. And they kept the process going. And this is a sketch of the work that they did in this excavation of La Magazine Royale. Each point, each data point you see here, this is 163 feet to the second Bunjo cabin, 166 feet from a large elm tree. There's a north, there's a scale. This is the type of scientific work that Richard did. This is the site itself, that's Richard there. You see these sticks coming up, there's a straight line. They found a straight line 30 feet by 40-foot rectangle, which is the dimension that Jean Kerr recorded they built. So what they really did is they put posts down into the ground, they put bark shelter on it, and that became La Magazine Royale. In 1759, when the British took Fort Niagara, the French came and burnt this to the ground with a hot fire. So those upright posts burnt right down into the hole, and that's why they showed up the way they did. So it's an interesting little exploration into scientific archaeology. This is a few of the artifacts were found, these particular ones. A lot of the artifacts went all over the place. Of course, everybody in Yandiara got some, Rochester Museum of Science got some, Buffalo History Museum got some, we've got some. This happens to be a display in our museum on Plain Street. There's a cross, that's a clay pottery shard, an earring, this is a musket flint, all sorts of neat things there. This is a photograph of my collection. One of the neat things that the Andiara people did is, because we were there all the time, when they had an abundance of things, we got to keep some of the stuff. They knew we had it, so I've got some things that are collected. These are clay trade pipes. These are a variety of different points. Normally you find them broken. Very seldom you find an entire. This is a coin. I don't know the era of it, but the outline of the head is George III, so it's Revolutionary War time. These are all examples of clay pottery with different types of decoration style. These are stones with the notches in it. They're called net sinkers. Back then they did fishing with vine nets that don't go down. So they'd make these stones to tie to the nets so they go down and catch fish. So anyway, that's just part of my collection. This is really pretty interesting. These are shark's teeth. There was a whole bunch of shark's teeth with holes drilled in them, discovered by the Cochins, actually at the Portage site, not at the Jonquière site. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that there's no sharks in the Niagara River. Never have been. Well, nah, probably not. I'm going to say maybe 12,000 years ago, but I doubt it. So somebody came at least 400 miles with a shark's tooth necklace and ended up leaving it here in Lewiston. Now you know what this is. This is the French castle. One of the stories about the French castle that bears on Lewiston and the lower landing is, you heard Bob say that as soon as they put the barkhouse up, they wanted something bigger. So they designed this, and Jonquière sold it to the Senecas as a house of peace. And this whole area right in here was a trade room. And he convinced them that if they could build a more substantial house of peace and trade zone, they could get more for their furs, ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. Some subgroup of the Senecas said, yes, go ahead and do it. Never the entire tribe. So this is the first prefab in American history. Because the French knew their design for this building wasn't called La Maison de Pièces, it was called La Maison de Machination, the House of Machinations. They knew it was nothing more than a fortress. If you look at this right now, it's all stone and lumber. These are heavy gauge wooden doors. The only way to get in here is if you get up against it, build a fire, and burn the door down. These machinations hang out over the face of the door, and they got slots in them so the soldiers can sit there, and everybody goes to burn the door, they get shot. So it was a really defensible thing. They had this whole thing designed. The stone was quarried in Fort Frontenac. The boards were cut to shape, put on a ship, brought to here to be built at Le Platon, right next to La Magazine Royale. That was the intent, to fortify this house in Lewiston at Art Park at the lower landing. They sent a French engineer by the name of Delaire, and when he sailed by the mouth of the Niagara River, he's looking at this thing and he's looking at this thing and said, boy, is that defensible. I really think that's pretty cool. Came up to Lewiston, took one look and said, yeah, no, we're not building it here. And went back down to the mouth and they built it there. But its intent was to be in Lewiston. Many people don't know that. So in 1759, 19-day siege, the British take Fort Niagara and the Niagara River away from the French, and the French influence here stops. They built, this is a photograph, that is the gully right there in the background, and there's a close-up. They built a little fortress called Fort Demler. So they actually built a fairly substantial structure there to protect the portage. In addition to that, they were the first ones to do some serious mapping. So this is an early 1760s map of the lower landing. The gully is right here. This is the cradles. I'm going to talk about that. The very first inclined railway in America, built right here. And these are some of the paths. There was a pathway directly up to the top, but they also had paths and then developed roadways coming up along slope through the escarpment, and this ultimately became a wagon cart trail. Up here was the top of the cradles, and this, I think, was done by a gentleman named Pfister. Now, this is a totally false picture, but this does do a nice job of telling you how the cradles worked. If you've seen this thing, the cradles actually began at the edge of water. It came up the gully, made a 90-degree turn, and then went several hundred feet to get to the top of the escarpment at Fort Gray, where the parkway comes down. This is nowhere near as big as it was, but what you can see here is you see there's two sets of tracks side by side, and there's a cart here with a load on it and a rope, and there's carts up here with a load on it and a rope, and the rope goes around a capstan, and there's a single man here turning the capstan. So by using counterweighted process. You could put a load of goods on down here and either stone or something else going the other way. One man could bring that up and down the hill, and that was the process. And this was improved. That's just another picture of the carrying place. That's what they were walking through before. We're going to skip over that. Okay. I can't skip over this one. What's it mean? Devil's Hole. Devil's Hole Massacre. So, remember the French were paying the Seneca 20 cents to do the pack. The British came in and they modified it. They machined it. They used carts and wagons. And the theory is that the Senecas were upset that they lost their jobs. And a lot of people want to say that the Devil's Hole Massacre was really about a labor dispute. And the Senecas getting their frustration out because they lost their job and they lost control. It was more than that. It was part of what's known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac was a native from the Detroit, Michigan area. And he had decided that all the whites had to go back to Europe. And he was trying to get all the natives to come together and sweep them back in the ocean and be done with it. It didn't get very far, but it did result in 1763 in the Devil's Hole Massacre. A wagon train led by John Stedman, who ran the portage for the British, and a number of soldiers were set upon right near Niagara University at Devil's Hole. They attacked and killed and captured most of the people there. The noise of the battle was heard by the British contingent at Fort Demler. They organized and ran back up. By the time they got there, the Indians had gotten back in the woods. They showed up and they were gone too. It was a bad situation. But we need to know about the Devil's Hole Massacre to appreciate what happens when the Americans be able to take over, and that's why I put that in there. As a result of that, this is the portage. This is Lewiston. This is the portage. And these block houses then were built by Captain John Montresor. And you could see one from the other, and they stationed men there. So after 1763, they weren't going to have that happen again. So they had soldiers stationed there all the while. I want to talk a little bit about Captain John Montresor. He's an interesting character, and again, we have a lot of interesting characters. He spent quite a bit of time here. He was in the French and Indian War, Braddock's expedition, which means that he probably was on a first-name basis with a gentleman named George Washington. He was at the siege of Louisbourg, siege of Quebec. He took part in Pontiac's Rebellion and the American Revolutionary War. He's at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Long Island, and the Battle of Brandywine. Pretty interesting personage. I happened to find this picture of him. I thought you'd be interested. So, by way of now segueing into the American occupation, this is where we're at. Native people have been drawn here for thousands of years. The beginning, in the early 1600s, the French began exploration. They controlled the portage from 1720 to 1759. The British controlled from 1759 until the settlement of the Revolutionary War. We like to think the Revolutionary War ended with Cornwallis surrendering at the Battle of Yorktown in 1783. The fact of the matter is the negotiations and the final treaty was not signed until 1796. This is known as the holdover period. In that entire period of time, the British Army was at Fort Niagara. And if you were a settler coming into the territory, like Ben Barton came here as a child with his father driving beef from New Jersey to Fort Niagara to feed the British Army. That's how he first came here in the 1790s. You had to have a written permission from the British to walk through New York State. This was not a happy time to be a settler in Western New York. But it led to some interesting things. So this is a picture of all of Western New York. The part that's colored here is what's known as the Holland Land Survey. The Holland Land Survey was a debt repayment. Robert Morris, during the Revolution, spent his entire personal fortune to feed, arm, and shelter the American Army. At the end of the Revolution, he was broke. So the Continental Congress arranged for him to be granted the right to sell this entire body of land and recoup his income. Problem is, that's going to take a little time. So what happened is there was a Dutch consortium of 9 banks from Holland, and he negotiated with them to buy it all, the right of resale, at one time, so he got a thunk payment. He was back to normal again, and the Holland Land Survey was created. Now, you'll notice there's a bunch of north-south lines here and a bunch of east-west lines. I'm a land surveyor, I gotta say this. In the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson adopted the public land state system. We have the 13 colonies, we've got colonial systems here. All the other states are surveyed by prime meridians and due east-west lines, based upon Joseph Ellicott's design of the Holland Land Survey. So the survey of the rest of the country came out of this effort. Just as a point of curiosity, this part of New York State has always been curious. This was defined as being a due south line from the extreme west end of Lake Ontario. So Joe Ellicott actually had to survey over to Burlington, locate that, calculate the due south line to set this up. Interesting stuff. Here's a blow-up. Here you see the Niagara River in the dark. This is the Holland Land Survey, and then there's this white stripe. This is what's known as the New York State Mile Reserve. The New York State Mile Reserve is unique in New York State. It came into the ownership of New York State by right of conquest of the United States over Great Britain. Great Britain owned it by right of a treaty with the Senecas in 1768, where in punishment for the Devil's Hole Massacre, they gave up the right to all land within 2 miles of the Niagara River, both sides. So they got a 4-mile wide strip of land, both sides. Only in the New York side is there any reminiscence of it. The Canadians, you never confederated until I think 1840. And by that time, they'd just forgotten about all that. But somehow, this got boiled down when it came into the control of New York State, and they said they're going to reserve a 1-mile wide strip. That land was owned in fee simple absolute by the state of New York. This land was owned in fee simple absolute by the Holland Land Survey, a private company, if you will. So in order for the Holland Land Survey to be completed, it had to bump up against the mile reserve line, and so that had to be established, and that never really happened until the late 1700s. This is a copy of Seth Pease' Surveyor, New York State Reservation Survey book, dated 1798. He actually surveyed the top of the bank of the Niagara River, calculated a line a mile in, and then went and monumented that line. The Holland Land Survey came in and adopted that, and that is in Lewiston, about where the Parkway comes down across as Route 104. So if you own land within a mile of the river, and you have an abstract of title, your title begins with the people of the state of New York. If you own on the other side of that line, it begins with a deed from a guy named William Willink, most likely, who was an agent for the Holland Land Company. So that's just an interesting, survey side. So in 1805, we start having fun, because the surveys have been completed. The Mile Reserve's been surveyed, the Holland Land Survey's been done, and in 1805, the state of New York opens up lands in the Mile Reserve for purchase. Prior to 1805, nobody had any property rights here. There had been people settling here, but they were settlers. They had no legal right to be there. So in the 1790s, Ben Barton, Joshua Fairbanks, and Robert Troop, and I'm not going to get into Robert Troop, I'm not going to explain that. If you heard my Frontier House thing, I'll just tell you this. From 1823, when they built the Frontier House, until 1828, that building stood on land that Ben Barton didn't own. Robert Troop did. And I don't know why. That's a mystery that I'm working on right now. But all three of these guys lived in Canandaigua in the 1790s. There were only 12 buildings in Canandaigua. They knew each other. There's no question about that. Barton and the others had visited Western New York as beef drovers. I mentioned that. In 1805, the Mile Reserve and the Holland Land Survey was completed. The state began to sell. Ben Barton bought Mile Reserve lots 19, 20, and 27 through 36. And while he was in Albany, he met Augustus Porter, and they bid on and won a lease to operate the cartage service from Lewiston to Niagara Falls for a period of 12 years. I've been searching for a document that demonstrates that. I haven't found it yet, but this is what all the history books tell me. This is a map. This is the village of Lewiston. When they did the Mile Reserve, they came down 20 lots. They're each about a quarter of a mile wide, and then they reserved a 1-mile strip for the village of Lewiston. The reason they picked that is Simeon DeWitt, Surveyor General of the state of New York, went to Ellicott, who was very familiar with this, and said, where's the best place to put a village? And he said, obviously the lower landing. And so that's where they put it. And so they skipped by that when they did the mile reserve. They just skipped the mile and did everything else. These areas shaded right here, these are the lots that Ben Barton bought. Augustus Porter bought the lots right at the edge of Niagara Falls. And then there were other buildings, other properties bought in the village of Lewiston. This is a copy of a page from Ben Barton's property ownership book. And we have this in the museum right now. And it says down here, in the mile strip, so-called along the Niagara River, lots number 19, 20, 27 through 36. Up here are the village lots that he owns. It doesn't include the lot that he built the Frontier House on. But this is kind of an interesting document to see some. We also have the Barton Family Bible now, which is pretty interesting. I like maps, sorry. This is the first map of the village of Lewiston, done in 1798 under the direction of Simeon DeWitt. Lewiston is one of only 3 villages in the entire state that are unique in that they were all owned in fee simple absolute by the people of the state of New York. And so the survey of it was ordered by the Surveyor General, a position that no longer exists. And this is the first design. They designed Center Street and 3 parallel streets below it and 3 parallel streets above it. They named them after the 6 nations. So we're still trying to curry favor with the Native Americans. So we got Tuscarora, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. The northerly limit of the village was the north line of Mohawk Street and the south line of Tuscarora Street. There was still land in the mile reserve out in here, but it wasn't in the original design. These dark lines right here, these are called hachures. They indicate change in elevation or slopes. This existed when they designed the village. It was literally formed by Niagara Falls 12,000 years ago. So when you're going down Center Street and you go between the Barton Mansion and the Fairbanks Mansion and you start to go down the hill, those slopes on both sides, that's natural. Nobody built that. They just fitted Center Street into it, and then of course down here was the big flats. Right down here, this is the original lower landing. So it's outside of the village of Lewiston. So what happens in this era, when the Americans take over, is there begins a process of moving this as the center of commerce to the foot of Center Street as the center of commerce, and we begin to decline in the importance of the lower landing. There's just a fancy map of the lower landing. This is interesting. You see this right here, and this right here, and this right here? These are 3 pieces of timber on end. It's at the bottom of the gully, adjacent to the Niagara River. There's the water of the Niagara River. Until this year, these have always been about 6 to 8 inches underwater, but for some reason the lower river is really low this year. So this is the remnant of somebody's wharf that was built at the bottom of the gully. And I'm not telling you it was from Ben Barton. I'm not telling you it's from any of that, because the early 1900s there were all sorts of fishing facilities down here. This was a ferry landing for a while. But, you know, this might have been somebody's fishing dock in the early 1900s, but it's reminiscent of the fact that wharfs were a big part of the importance of the lower landing for many years. There's a close-up of what it looks like today. You can walk down there and take a look at it, but once you're down there, you got to come back up. And it's getting harder and harder all the time. Erie Canal, 1825, Porter Barton and Company no longer have anything to offer, because now you can take goods directly from Albany through the Erie Canal directly to Buffalo. The lower landing, the portage, as a viable alternative for transporting goods, loses its benefit. And so we begin a new era. This is an example of a Conestoga wagon on a barge. This is an example of a horse-drawn barge. That's what operated at the foot of Ferry Street for many years. They literally had horses on treadmills, and we know in the written record that Conestoga, the settlers from the east, looking for opportunity, wanted to go to Detroit area. Well, if you were to drive to Detroit today and you didn't have COVID and the border was closed, you'd go across the river, you'd go through London, Ontario, through Windsor, and into Detroit. That was the simplest way to go in the 1800s. There were stories of Conestoga wagons backed up Ferry Street to Center Street and out Center Street to Ridge Road, waiting to cross this ferry to go across Canada to get to Michigan. The income from this ferry funded the academy at Academy Park for many, many years. When the academy closed, the ferry lost its importance. In 1838, and I got a better picture of this here, Seymour Scoville came from, now it says 1836 under this picture, I believe it was 1838. He came here from Lockport and he built this house on Oak Hill. Oak Hill is in Art Park. It's in the same woods that the burial mound is in. And at one time, if you walk up to the top of the hill, you will see that entire long hilltop has a fitted stone fence all the way around it. It was a beautiful garden. And this mansion was up there. Beautiful gardens, and I've read in several different locations that there was a underground tunnel that went out the back to the south, which would lead, built in 1838, it's just prior to the Civil War. We had the Freedom Crossing, the Underground Railroad going on. It kind of fits in with that kind of possibility. I have never seen any evidence that anybody found that, but there's an indication that it's there. The other interesting thing about this is that a fellow named Kesselring stayed here one time with the Starkweather sisters. Kesselring was an author who wrote Arsenic and Old Lace, which is a play about two old ladies who don't like people very much. And they say that he based the characters, the two women, on the Starkweather sisters from his time here. The other interesting story about this is when Scoville got ensconced on this beautiful mansion in the hill, he wanted to go and do what all the other businessmen in the town did. He wanted to go to the Frontier House at night, have a drink, and play cards. But for him to do that, he had to walk out toward the river down to 4th Street, all the way up 4th Street and around them. He got sick and tired of that, hired some people to get a road directly from his front porch, which is right here, to the front door of the Frontier House, and that is now known as Niagara Street. It goes right by our museum. So Niagara Street was never it was never on any of the plans until he built that thing, and then they kind of fit it in. So it's an interesting little thing. Nothing up there now but ruins. This is something that most people don't know anything about. This is called the Porter Fiber Bottle Factory. Porter Fiber Bottle Factory was on the lower landing. This is the rail of the Niagara Gorge route. These are the scoundrels that ran the place to a certain extent. A fellow by the name of Major Porter, no relation to the Porter Company that was well ensconced here. He was from Boston, Massachusetts area. Had a plan to make all sorts of products out of wood fiber, much like what this type of thing is. Oh, I'm not supposed to wonder. This is an example of a wood fiber product. His product was made using Portland cement, sand, water, and some other appliances. And he raised a lot of money. They put 90 carpenters on here and built this thing, this main plant here, very quickly. Then they expanded on it, put in their own water source, and it was a big deal. People were being hired from all over New England to come here. Every building in Lewiston was fixed up to rent because we had no place to store people. The people of Lewiston were excited about this industry coming here and giving us real hope. He was going to duplicate another factory on the Canadian side. Well, that was in 1906. And obviously he got it built, and he made some samples, and he went bankrupt. And by 1907 or so, the company had kind of given up, 1908 maybe, and it sat there empty for many, many years. There is a very sad story that, I'm not sure exactly what year it is, but the girl's name was Agnes McCabe. She was 11 years old. It was her task to take a dinner pail to the night watchman, Mr. Richards, I think his name was. And one evening, she took it to him, and he took his big overcoat off, and he had a handgun in there. He came out, hit the floor, shot the girl in the belly, and she died the following day. You got newspaper articles from the Niagara Gazette that kind of, and a lot of these guys got hurt. This OSHA didn't have any say in this matter. This is a rough and tumble. One guy fell in a well, and it didn't last much longer after that. But anyway, the Porter Fiber Bottle Factory. I know a lot about this. Anybody remember Bob Baker? Bob and Bobby Baker lived in the village for many years. They had the little place the house right across the street here. You know the Bakers. Well, when Bob Baker died, Bobby gave me he did all the research on the Porter Bottle Factory, and so I've got that. I'll be giving it to the museum very quickly. Here's a picture. This is the trestle. This is the gully. This is the lower landing. Here's the railroad trestle that the Niagara Gorge went over. There's a man standing there. There's the Porter Fiber Bottle Factory in the background. And if you've ever noticed, there's a little stone foundation in the ground right here in Art Park. I think that's the basis of this building. It's got nothing to do with Fort Demler, but this is just kind of give you a perspective of what it looked like. These are modern day photographs. This is looking north. That's the trestle foundation. That man would have been standing right about here, and I'm just looking across the gully. And this is on the other side, standing about there and looking down. You see the concrete footers, and that's the pump house that we talked about a little bit earlier. Here's another photograph, probably taken from the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, Canadian side. And there's the trestle, and there's the building I just talked about, Porter Fiber Bottle Factory. You see down here there was a big house built, and then this is the road that went down to the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge. This is an aerial photograph of the Chateau Gay. That's the winery that was there. This is the waterworks. When I lived in this house, that's where I grew up, 1948 to 1963. This was the waterworks. That's where the village DPW was located. But originally, that was the water line came from the pump house up through that and distributed into the village. And then in this location, this is before John built the Bunjo Motel. So the Bunjo Motel would have been in here, and then the Magazine Royale would have been back down here. This was a roadway went up into the quarries. And this was the road that went to the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge. Niagara River up there. Here's another aerial. Now this is when the Niagara Power Project was just wrapping up. This is all the stone that was brought in and dumped from the construction of the project. That's the Chateau Gay. And here, it's got to be after 1960 because the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge is gone. Those two pillars are still there, and that's now got an artwork on it called Omega, which I'm sure you've seen. And this would be the gully. My house would have been right there. That's the waterworks. It's another view. There's the Niagara River, the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge with the suspension. I'm confused by this. Tom Collister and I were talking about this. He thinks this is the foot of Tuscarora Street, where they just built the new condominiums. I don't know what it is. It's another curiosity I've got to take a look at. But you look up on the escarpment, and all those mansions aren't shown up yet. So it's sometime prior to the early 1900s when they started to build those beautiful homes up there. In 1998, with Patricia Scott's help and a number of others, the Historic Association, we worked to have this site protected under the National Park Service. And what they did is they actually took the Fort Niagara protection and extended it geographically to include the lower landing, and it's now a nationally protected park. We had a great big party this time. I've got some photographs here I didn't build in here. We had a lot of people here. We had a big party just like we did in September, but then we had a boat ride from the foot of Lewiston down to Fort Niagara. We got off Fort Niagara and had a meal. It was a big deal. So this has been protected since 1998. And this is about the end of my saying, and I actually did pretty good. It's only 20 minutes long. This again is a picture of Richard McCarthy. And Tom, I'm going to ask you to step forward and bring Gene forward if you would. This is Richard in the Fort Niagara Archaeological Museum. After we had met Jean, she and her daughter came to our museum to see some of the records that we had of her father's work. And in doing that, we showed them a copy of this archaeological book. And you're not going to be able to see it from there, but you can look at it later. This is the same photograph as in here for the dedication by the authors, which included the Scotts. And it says, "This history of Art Park and the story of this land's early use as the lower landing is dedicated to Richard McCarthy, who preserved much of Art Park's past for us to build upon. It is the hope of all who worked on this narrative that this land, now dedicated to creativity, can be modernized as needed without forgetting the significance of the past." Jean had never known about this book, and she expressed an interest in it, and we didn't have one. We couldn't get our hands on one. But in the meantime, I've been in touch. Tom, would you give this to her? I got in touch with Pat Scott, and this, I've never seen it in red. This is their last copy. It was their personal book that they worked in. They have dedicated this to you, and there's a personal letter in here from Pat Scott that we'd like you to have as a way of thanks. So there's a letter in there from Pat. Did you ever know her personally?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I knew her by reputation.
Yeah,
I
they.
remember my dad driving up to Fort Niagara to see the Scots
Yeah,
frequently.
that's probably what he was doing right there.
Yeah.
But they were delighted to give this to you. Patricia told me that they were really
Oh, my.
fascinated by your father, and a lot of this history and a lot of that work is to his credit. And we thank you very much for coming out this evening and being patient while we got it.
And your presentation was marvelous.
Thank you.
Just,
I appreciate that.
I can't thank you enough for this. This is absolutely marvelous. After I came to the John Fair celebration, I went home and dug out all the memorabilia and papers and paperwork and newspaper clippings and programs and booklets and things on my dad. So,
Yeah.
and then of course followed up with coming up to your museum, and this was just amazing when I saw this, and I saw my father's picture in there with the dedication. So I am absolutely thrilled to have this.
Well, it's for your family to have for eternity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
That pretty much is it for my presentation. I know that I've talked a long while. If there are questions, I will be glad to answer them. If not, and you want to go home and get bourbon, I understand what that's all about. But thank you all very much for coming, and I'll stand around and answer any questions you may have. I've talked pretty thoroughly. Thank you.